What can we learn from Balaam's donkey? Everyone is familiar with the story that we read in this week's Torah portion about how Balak, the leader of the Moabite nation, hires Balaam, a heathen prophet who had power with his words to curse or to bless, that he should come and curse the Jewish people. And he was hesitant, and then he goes and he stays back. And finally, he goes in that direction to carry out the mission. And he's riding on his donkey, and an angel stands in the way, and the donkey turns, tries to avoid the angel, and Balaam doesn't see the angel, strikes the donkey 3 times, and God opens up the mouth of the donkey. This great miracle occurs, and the donkey complains to Balaam, and he says to him, "Why did you strike me these 3 times?" Now, the word for times in Hebrew is pa'amim, but it doesn't use that word. It uses the word regalim. Why did you strike me 3 regalim? What does that mean, 3 regalim? Regel is the foot, and the holidays that Jews observe, known as the pilgrimage holidays, are 3 pilgrimage holidays. Shalosha regalim, they're called. Why are they called regalim? Because one would have to go by foot to Jerusalem to bring a sacrifice in the Holy Temple in Jerusalem 3 times a year. You would have to appear. Everyone would leave their homes and they would travel to Jerusalem, mostly by foot, and they would appear in the temple. When was that? During Passover, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. Those are the 3 pilgrimage holidays. So the donkey, whose verbiage was obviously God sending a message through him, says to Balaam, "Why did you strike me?" Meaning, why did you make me go in the direction of bringing a curse upon the Jewish people who are known, or will be known, for their traveling by foot on the 3 pilgrimage holidays? In other words, he's telling him, how could you curse such a people? These are an incredible people. These people will go on a pilgrimage 3 times a year, and you curse them? So the question that arises, without much thought even, is that's all the Jewish people could be praised for? That they would go and travel to Jerusalem 3 times a year? There are no other mitzvahs, no other good deeds, no other virtues, no other qualities that the donkey, who was speaking, obviously a channel for God's speech to him, that he could have mentioned? Why is this singled out as if this is something very unique about the Jewish people? So one simple way of explaining it would be as follows. Yes, it's true. The Jewish people had many virtues, many merits. They performed many mitzvahs. But when you're dealing with being protected, when you're very vulnerable, you need an armor. You need something very, very tough, without any chinks in it, that would not allow an enemy's weapons to penetrate. And that armor is faith. And that's what the pilgrimage holidays are all about. They're about the incredible faith the Jewish people had. Imagine this. You're living in a country like Israel today, and it was no different then, surrounded by enemies who tried to conquer you, tried to drive you out, tried to destroy you. And they know that 3 times a year you pick up your bags, you take your family, and you travel all the way to Jerusalem from one end of Israel to the other. And they wouldn't be tempted to overrun the country and at the very least, steal everything, and then maybe even use their advance into the country, to the interior, to fight and destroy the Jewish people. And yet the Jewish people had such faith in God that for year after year after year, they would all travel to Jerusalem, not worrying about what's going to happen back at home, because they had such implicit trust in God. That made them not be vulnerable. That took away their vulnerability, and that would protect them because they had such faith. And this is the basis of a law. The Talmud mentions, Shluchei mitzvah einam nizokin. If you are sent a messenger to perform a mitzvah, you're not going to be harmed. Of course, there are exceptions to every rule. The Talmud says when the damage is almost inevitable, you don't take advantage of this law. But generally speaking, when you're there to do a mitzvah, you are not going to be damaged. And that, incidentally, is the reason for the custom many people have, that when someone you know goes on a trip, you give him $1 or any amount of money and say, be my messenger to deposit this to tzedakah, to charity, when you arrive at your destination. That way, every trip becomes a mitzvah trip and you're protected. So in short, faith is the power that Jewish people have. And I should also mention the misunderstanding that many people have because of their involvement with or their influence by the other religion, that faith is not important in Judaism. That's the canard that we often hear. Other religions focus on faith. Judaism focuses on action. While that's true that Judaism focuses on action, it doesn't do that at the expense of faith. And actually, faith is the very foundation of Judaism. You can't build a structure of many stories without a foundation, because even if you build it, it will eventually collapse. The foundation is what keeps the structure whole and intact. And that's why Judaism does put tremendous emphasis on faith as the foundation of all of Judaism. If you have a strong foundation, then you are strong, and then you are impervious to the attacks of our enemies. Excuse me. Okay, so now we know that Balaam thought the Jewish people were vulnerable, and he was told by this donkey they're not vulnerable. Look what kind of faith they have. But there's a midrash that goes a step further and says that God says to Balaam, you want to curse the people, you want to get rid of them. Who's going to fulfill the Torah? Who's going to observe the commandments? And Balaam said, I volunteer, I'll do it. You don't need the Jews. I will do their mitzvot. And the Midrash says, but God says back to them, and presumably, according to the Midrash, this was all part of the dialogue between the donkey and Balaam, says, yeah, you can fulfill all of the mitzvahs, but there's one mitzvah you cannot fulfill. You can't go on a pilgrimage. You're exempted from that because the Mishnah teaches us that a person who is either lame, they can't walk, they're crippled. Today we, of course, use a more sensitive term. They're physically disabled by virtue of the fact that their legs don't function properly. Or a blind person is also exempted from going on the pilgrimage. Balaam was afflicted in both ways. Balaam was crippled, he was disabled, and he also was blind in one eye. And that's why God says to him, there's no replacement for the Jewish people because you don't have that ability, because you can't walk right and you can't see right. What does that have to do with going on a pilgrimage, and what does that tell us? So it tells us that in order to go on a pilgrimage, what does that really mean? Going on a pilgrimage means that you're going to be face to face with God. You're going to elevate yourself. You're going to sanctify yourself. You need to have the ability to walk, not just physically, but spiritually walk. What are our legs? Our legs transport our whole body. Yes, we have a brain, a head, the most important part of the body. We have a heart, we have other vital organs, but they cannot move anywhere. They're not mobile without the legs. The legs support the whole human structure. And that's what we call faith. Faith is not just one of many mitzvahs, many things that God commands us to have and to cultivate. Faith is the very foundation, as we mentioned before, but faith is what gets us to learn Torah. If we have faith, if we are connected to God, then we will want to study His Torah. We will want to fulfill His commandments. Balaam didn't have that faith. Yes, Balaam was exposed to God. God spoke to him. He was a prophet. But that didn't enhance his faith, because the second that God would somehow disappear from his radar, that would be the end of his experience with God. His relationship with God, as great as it was not a moral relationship. It didn't affect his behavior. It didn't impact him. It was just another gift. It's like someone who has a phenomenal memory. Doesn't necessarily mean they'll be a good person. He had a gift that God was able to communicate with him. But then also he was blind in one eye. What does that mean? Blindness, metaphorically, means someone who doesn't see reality from God's perspective. He sees everything from a very human, naturalistic, and secular vantage point. A person who is blind cannot perceive the spirituality in this world, can't perceive the godliness in this world. But what does it mean that he was blind in one eye? And Hasidic masters explain that the reason why God created us with two eyes, physically two eyes, is because it's a reflection of the spiritual eyes of our soul. And we also have two eyes. That means two ways of looking at things, two different perspectives. The right eye, the right is always considered to be the one associated with the trait of kindness, the attribute of kindness and love. The right eye is the eye in which we look up to see God's presence in our world, to see the greatness of God, to speculate and meditate on God. The second eye, the left eye, which is the weaker eye, is there to look at ourselves in a way that we are able to judge ourselves, look at our faults, look at our deficiencies, our flaws. So it actually says in the Code of Jewish Law that before we start our prayers in the morning, we're supposed to meditate on the greatness of God and the insignificance of man, how insignificant we really are. We shouldn't let whatever we have, whatever assets we possess, go to our heads. Balaam had only one eye. He was a prophet. He saw godliness. He communicated with God. He saw God's greatness. But it didn't affect him at all. He lacked total humility. He could not see his own insignificance. In fact, his blindness in one eye was worse than someone who was blind in two eyes spiritually, because at least the person who is blind in two eyes will not see God's greatness, but will not use that God's greatness as a way to enhance his own self-image. Balaam, because he was able to see God's greatness, he was able to communicate with God and God communicate with him, that went to his head. That made him even more arrogant. So with this type of arrogance, this blindness, Balaam was not a candidate to go on a pilgrimage. A person who has that inability to have faith and the inability to see things properly, to see God's greatness and one's own insignificance, that person is not qualified to go on a pilgrimage. They won't benefit from it. And the Jewish people who do go on the pilgrimage are not worthy of being cursed, God says to Balaam through the donkey, because they do go on this pilgrimage. They are visual. They do have legs to transport them. The Jewish people as a whole are a good people. Of course, there are individuals who sometimes adopt the Balaam mode of existence, but that's the exception to the rule. Now, we understand now what the significance of the pilgrimage is in the donkey's remarks to Balaam, chastising him for wanting to curse the Jewish people because they don't deserve to be cursed because they go on this pilgrimage. But it's about going on the pilgrimage 3 times a year. What's the significance of 3 times a year? So commentators point out that the 3 times a year correspond to the 3 patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Furthermore, they say they're connected to each of the holidays. Passover is associated with Abraham, Shavuot is associated with Isaac, Sukkot is associated with Jacob. There's also 3 things upon which the world stands, our sages tell us in Ethics of the Fathers. The world stands on 3 things: Torah, service, prayer, sacrifices, and acts of loving kindness. So Passover, which is identified with Abraham, he was a man of loving kindness. Shavuot, which is identified with Isaac, is the day we got the Torah. That, of course, associates with Torah study. And Sukkot, which is associated with Jacob, there are 2 ways of actually doing this. The second holiday, Yitzchak, he was the man of Gevurah. He was the man of harsh judgment, rigid judgment. And Jacob is the one who's associated with compassion. So we have the 3 holidays corresponding to the 3 patriarchs. One could go a step further and connect it to what the Talmud says, that someone who doesn't have these three traits, we can be suspicious of their Jewish identity. What are these three different states? One is Gomli Chasadim, people who are kind. One is people who are Baishanim, who are modest, have humility. And the third is Rachmanim, people who have mercy or compassion. These correspond to the three patriarchs as well. Abraham is the paragon of the virtue of kindness. Isaac is the paragon of gevura, of shame, of self-effacement. And Jacob is the one who's associated with rachmim, with compassion. So what Balaam was trying to do was trying to undermine these three things. And if we look in Ethics of the Fathers, we find this stated almost explicitly. In chapter 5 of Ethics of the Fathers, the Mishnah says as follows: whoever possesses the following three characteristics is of the disciples of Abraham our father, and the three opposite characteristics is of the disciples of the wicked Balaam. What is the wicked Balaam? So let's go through these three first with Balaam. The disciples of the wicked Balaam possess an evil eye, an arrogant spirit, and a greedy soul. What do these three things mean? An evil eye is someone who sees the negative in everyone, who can't see the positive in another person. An arrogant spirit is, as the word arrogant implies, someone who's very haughty, egotistical, who looks down at others. And a greedy soul, someone who wants everything for himself, very greedy, doesn't want to share with anyone else, has no compassion for others, has no desire to be kind to others. And Abraham's disciples are the opposite. They have a good eye, a humble spirit, and a meek soul. In other words, not someone who's looking to hoard everything for himself. The Rabbi once spoke about the fact that before the coming of Mashiach, before the final redemption, we're going to witness, and we have witnessed, a new phenomenon. That some people who we thought of as being very fine people, very good people, seem to exhibit some terrible characteristics, as if coming out of nowhere. We knew them as good, decent people, and all of a sudden they snap and they become very rotten, whether it becomes a pattern or whether it's a sporadic thing, but it's something that's out of character. And conversely, we find people who we look at as ordinary people, nothing to write home about, and all of a sudden they shine, they become heroic, they accomplish tremendous things. The Rebbe explained that phenomenon is connected to the fact that we're right before the coming of Mashiach. Because Daniel, the prophet Daniel, says that before the Messianic age, everything will come out in the open. There's not going to be any hiding. Everything is out in the open. And there's a reason why that, because we want to correct everything. We want to refine everything. We want to prepare the world, pave the way for the final redemption. So if there are subliminal or subconscious traits that we have that are not positive, we want to expose them and deal with them and get rid of them. And conversely, if we have positive traits that we're not even aware of, then we wasted our resources. We have to experience all of our resources, all of our qualities. It's a terrible thing to have someone who has the potential to do great things and they don't even know about their potential. So everything has to come out in the open before the coming of Mashiach. Now, in the event that qualities, positive qualities come out, smooth sailing. Don't worry about it. There's nothing for you to worry about. Just make sure that you cultivate it. But what about the person who suddenly experiences such negativity? And we can sometimes point to it in ourselves, that there are times when we're disgusted with our own attitude, that we're so nasty and negative, and it's out of character with who we are. Our parents didn't act that way. They didn't show us that way, and we become very depressed about it. So what do? So the Rebbe says you need a mentor. But what kind of a mentor? You need a mentor who has the three signs that I mentioned before that correspond to the three festivals. What are the three signs? They have to be kind, you have to be humble, and you have to be compassionate. Find a mentor who has these three legs, these three virtues, because the fact that they're kind means they have a good eye. They see things in a positive way. The fact that they're humble means that they're not going to give you advice that is self-serving for them, but is not necessarily good for you. And of course, the compassion will force them to really care about you, even if somehow they feel that you're not really so deserving. But whatever it is, you need to find someone, a mentor, who has these three qualities, and that person will help you deal with your newfound negative traits and maybe help you cultivate the newly discovered positive traits. Balaam, our sages tell us, wanted to curse the people. That's in the Torah itself, but our sages tell us that even as he was blessing them against his own will, he was forced to bless them, in his mind he was thinking the opposite. So even when he prophesizes the coming of Mashiach, and he's talking about how Mashiach will come and how glorious it'll be, that's one of his blessings, in his mind he was thinking the opposite. And that's why he wanted to curse them, because he could not tolerate, he didn't have these three virtues, and he was doing everything in his power to undermine the Jewish people so they will never reach the coming of Mashiach, because he will deny them these three virtues. So the message of the donkey is the Jewish people are a unique people. We have tremendous qualities, but we also have faults. But when we take advantage of these three traits, we go to a mentor who is kind, humble, and compassionate, we can deal with all of these traits. And we're getting close to Yud Beis Tammuz, the 12th day of Tammuz, which is the day the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe was liberated from Soviet imprisonment. When he was a child, he asked his father, who was his predecessor, why is it that we have one nose, one mouth, but two eyes? He was a little toddler, and his father said that we have two eyes. With one eye, the right eye, the stronger eye, spiritually speaking, we look at another person to see the good in that person. With a weaker eye, we look at a candy, at something physical, something that is not going to last, something that has no intrinsic spiritual value. That we have to incorporate in our own lives. That's called being able to see with both eyes, that we can value what deserves to be valued and we devalue that which deserves to be devalued. And that prepares us for the ultimate pilgrimage to Jerusalem, to the third holy temple that will be built imminently.